Well, the U.S. vice presidential debate proved to be very different than the presidential debate last month. Different in that it was substantive and far more cordial.
Tim, first of all, I didn't know that your 17-year-old witnessed a shooting. I'm sorry about that, and I hope that he's doing okay. So. Christ have mercy. It is awful.
Well, I've enjoyed tonight's debate, and I think there was a lot of commonality here. And I'm sympathetic to misspeaking on things, and I think I might have with the senator.
Me too, man. And I think that Governor Walz and I actually probably agree that we need to do better on this. The question is just how do we actually do it?
Still, there were clear differences between policies and assessments of the challenges the United States faces, and arguably it was a first chance for many Americans to hear and assess both the Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. With more on last night's vice presidential debate, we're now joined by Larry Jacobs. He is the founder and the director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota. Larry, Professor Jacobs, thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Listen, several media organizations, they conducted these so-called Insta-polls right after the debate. Washington Post was one of them. And when it comes to the Washington Post, they gathered a group of independents, and by the end of the night, the vast majority believed that J.D. Vance was the clear winner of the contest. Do you agree with that assessment?
I'm not sure. I think they both, performed well. Governor Walz stumbled out of the blocks. It was clearly nervous, and it took him a few minutes to get his bearings, but then he did, and he was able to highlight some areas of significant difference on which a good number of Americans probably agree with him, on abortion for sure. And then at the end of the debate, there was a very telling exchange around the issue of democracy. And J.D. Vance would not walk away from Donald Trump's support of the January 6th insurrection. It was quite telling. Now, whether there were many viewers after an hour and a half is an open question.
Yeah, because it did run rather late, and that question in particular was in the second half of the debate. But let's talk a bit more about that, because, J.D. Vance did a relatively good job last night of defending or trying to make an argument for the Trump first administration. But when it came to the January 6th question, that was a noticeable stumble. Let's play a bit of it for people at home.
Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
It's a damning non-answer for you to not talk about censorship.
So let's talk a bit more about that response then. What impact do you think that will actually have on this election?
I don't think it's going to have much of an impact. It was a damning non-answer. I agree with Governor Walz on that. And I think J.D. Vance was trying to do his best to defend or avoid a topic on which Donald Trump remains out of line with what most Americans think, and I think what's necessary for American democracy to move forward. I think the key issues last night were around the economy and whether or not Americans think we're heading in the right direction or off on the wrong track. And I think on that, J.D. Vance was more effective and maybe more potent in terms of moving a small number of perhaps decisive voters in the direction of Donald Trump.
Well, let's also talk about Governor Walz here, because you talked about how he stumbled out of the blocks, a bit nervous off top. And I think, up until this point, Governor Walz has enjoyed a lot of good publicity, a lot of good feedback about who he is. But there was a question last night, which I think many people who have not followed Minnesota politics in particular were unaware of until a question was asked about a past claim made by Walz about being in Hong Kong during the Tiananmen massacre. Let's take a listen to that question and basically how the governor answered it.
All I said on this was I got there that summer and misspoke on this. So I will just, that's what I've said. So I was in Hong Kong and China during the democracy protests went in. And from that, I learned a lot of what needed to be in governance.
Professor Jacobs, from the moment that Tim Walz was chosen as Kamala Harris's running mate, he had that very powerful acceptance speech during the DNC. He had an equally powerful speech where people were screaming for coach, coach, coach. And then last night, this nervous performance at times, and then this stumbling answer about, I guess, a fish story, a big fish story on his part. What do you make of that? What impact will that actually have on the type of publicity he gets going forward, and really scrutiny going forward?
Up to this point, J.D. Vance has had very weak evaluations from Americans. He's seen as really a threat to particularly women and a bit hard-edged. Last night, he lifted his approval ratings, I think, by appearing empathetic and civil, whereas I think Governor Walz probably hurt himself. People saw him double-speaking in a way that politicians are sometimes caught. He was clearly caught on this misstatement or overstatement about being in Tiananmen Square during the brutal suppression by the Chinese government.
So you made a comment going into this debate that most times VP debates don't make much of a difference in a presidential race. But given how close things are, and they really are very close within margins of error in many of the swing states, do you think what we saw last night will make any difference in any one of those states?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. Vice presidential debates rarely matter. It's the undercard for the main battle, which is between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. On the other hand, if you look back at 2020, it was decided by 21,000 votes in 3 states out of 155 million ballots cast. And we're likely to see something pretty close again. And so not having much of an impact could still be decisive. I think the key dynamic last night was that J.D. Vance kept going back to the issues of the economy and immigration. And we know that Americans consider those the top 2 issues, that they give Donald Trump the advantage on them. They see him as more likely to be a change agent, whereas Kamala Harris is seen as someone more likely to continue with the same approach. That's just not good news for the Harris-Walz ticket. And I think last night, J.D. Vance was able to carry through the brief in emphasizing those issues. And for voters who are maybe up for grabs, who heard that, I think they're going to be thinking, I'm not sure about Donald Trump. He could be a monster, but maybe America needs a monster at this moment.
Well, as we say, the race is still very close. We're watching very intently from here in Canada. Larry Jacobs, thank you for the time.
Good to be with you.